Welcome to Booklaunch on YouTube.
Shortly after the Brexit referendum result was declared early on Friday the 24th of June 2016, David Cameron emerged from the front door of 10 Downing Street to make two important announcements. The first was that he would be resigning as Prime Minister. The other was that the government would not immediately be notifying the European Council, under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, of its intention to withdraw from the EU. Article 50 of the treaty says that a member state can withdraw from the EU in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. But what were they? The UK's constitution is uncodified, largely unwritten, and there was nothing in the referendum legislation to say what should happen next. In a newspaper article published a few hours after the result was declared, I suggested that giving effect to Brexit would require parliamentary approval. That proved to be correct, although I did not go so far as to say it would be unlawful for the government to trigger Article 50 without first obtaining an Act of Parliament. The credit for that argument must go to three constitutional lawyers: Nick Barber, Tom Hickman and Jeff King. In a blog published the following Monday, they argued that ministers couldn't use their prerogative powers to overturn a statute. Before an Article 50 declaration can be issued, they wrote, Parliament must enact a statute empowering the Prime Minister to issue a notice under Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon. That was an important proposition, and it needed to be tested in the courts. Mishcon de Reya was one of several law firms that took up the challenge. Its lawyers signed up a public-spirited investment manager named Gina Miller and argued on her behalf that triggering Brexit would require primary legislation. On the 3rd of November 2016, the High Court agreed. Judgment in the Miller case was delivered by Lord Thomas of Coombe-Gearth, Sir Terence Etherton and Lord Justice Sales. The sole question in this case, said the three senior judges, is whether, as a matter of the constitutional law of the United Kingdom, the Crown, acting through the executive government of the day, is entitled to use its prerogative powers to give notice under Article 50 for the United Kingdom to cease to be a member of the European Union. The judge's answer was unflinching. Without specific authority from Parliament, they ruled, the Crown cannot, through the exercise of its prerogative powers, alter the domestic law of the United Kingdom and modify rights acquired in domestic law under the European Communities Act 1972. We hold, said the judges, that the Secretary of State does not have the power, under the Crown's prerogative, to give notice for the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union. If ministers couldn't use their inherent powers to trigger Brexit, they'd have to ask Parliament to pass legislation. But some of those who'd voted to leave the EU didn't want MPs to have anything to do with the Article 50 notification. If Parliament had to give its approval, Brexit might never be triggered. On this argument, the judges could be seen as trying to obstruct the referendum result. Viewed from a constitutional perspective, the High Court judgment was entirely supportive of democracy. In what amounted to a choice between government and Parliament, the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls and a Lord Justice of Appeal had come down on the side of the legislature. Unfortunately, the High Court missed a trick by making no effort to sell its judgment to the people. It would have needed only another sentence, perhaps in a press summary, explaining that a simple act of Parliament would permit the government to do as it wished. Spelling this out would have helped shape broadcast news coverage on the day of the ruling, but it might not have had much effect on the Brexit-supporting newspapers. Coverage the following day played to readers' prejudices. The Sun carried a picture of Gina Miller under the headline, "Who do you," spelt EU, "think you are?" The Daily Express, in a front-page comment headlined, "We must get out of the EU," said that Britain was now facing a crisis as grave as anything since the dark days when Churchill vowed we would fight them on the beaches. It asserted, without a hint of irony or self-doubt, that the 3rd of November 2016 was the day democracy died. The Daily Telegraph, which used to be regarded as a serious newspaper, printed official photographs of the three judges in monochrome, with a blue tint to make them look more sinister. Its headline read, "The Judges versus the People." But the Daily Mail could be relied on to top that. Its front-page story carried the byline of James Slack, who later joined Downing Street as Theresa May's spokesman. But it was written by Paul Dacre, the then editor. This is how it began. MPs last night tore into an unelected panel of out-of-touch judges for ruling that embittered Remain supporters in Parliament should be allowed to frustrate the verdict of the British public. Above the story were slightly out-of-date photographs of the three judges, two of them in the full-bottomed wigs that are worn only on ceremonial occasions. The subheading was, "Fury over out-of-touch judges who defied 17.4 million Brexit voters and could trigger constitutional crisis." And the headline dominating the page was, "Enemies of the People." As Lord Thomas's successor noted nearly 2 years later, that was a phrase used by tyrants throughout history to justify the persecution and death of those who don't toe the line. Looking back, a former foreign editor of the Times said it was one of the most chilling headlines ever to appear in a British newspaper. But it was only a headline. My first reaction was to dismiss the Mail's coverage as something that would soon be forgotten. Today's news, tomorrow's fish and chip paper, as we used to say. But the Lord Chief Justice and his two colleagues were far less relaxed, and they looked to the government for support. In decades gone by, the Lord Chancellor would have spoken on their behalf, but that great office of state was then occupied by Liz Truss MP, who was something of a political lightweight. Nothing was heard from her for a couple of days, presumably because she was waiting for instructions from Downing Street, and nobody in the Prime Minister's office grasped the dangers of delay. Eventually, Truss expressed the view that judicial independence was the foundation on which our rule of law is built. When pressed, she said it wasn't for her to condemn the newspapers. Well, indeed it was not, but what Truss was being asked to do was to defend the independence of the judiciary, in line with the oath she'd taken on her appointment. As the judges saw it, that meant explaining that they'd been traduced in the media. Truss's response was condemned by Lord Judge, a former Lord Chief Justice, as a little too late and quite a lot too little. A couple of years later, Lord Neuberger said that Truss had completely missed the point. She had been free to criticise the press and she should have done so. But Neuberger, who by then had retired as President of the Supreme Court, was in forgiving mood. In fairness to her, he said, she was a very recent appointment. She had no experience of the rule of law and of the judiciary. It was unfortunate and she should have got it right, but I think there were mitigating circumstances. What Truss could fairly have pointed out was that under the new constitutional settlement reached more than a decade earlier, she was no longer head of the judiciary. That role had been transferred from the Lord Chancellor to the Lord Chief Justice. The whole point of the 2005 reform, said Professor Graham Gee in 2019, was to standardise the role of the Lord Chancellor, so that Lord Chancellors would take not an independent line, but a government line on matters relating to the judicial system. Truss could have argued that Lord Thomas should have been defending himself and his colleagues, self-serving though that would inevitably have appeared. But there's no way round the fact that it's the duty of the Lord Chancellor to uphold and defend judicial independence. Lord Dyson, who before his retirement was the most mild-mannered of judges, was still incandescent when he wrote, in a memoir published 2 years later, that Truss's 11 months in office had been disastrous. Not the least of her shortcomings, he said, was her failure to discharge the statutory duty to protect the independence of the judges when they were pilloried by some of.
That was Joshua Rozenberg reading from his book Enemies of the People, published by Bristol University Press. The book is available from the Booklaunch online bookshop at £13.19. That's a saving of £1.80 on the recommended retail price.